warrior, wildcatter, congressman, party boss, spy chief, diplomat, and 41st President of the United States. For 94 years, George Herbert Walker Bush led an extraordinary American life of service to his nation and devotion to his family. As leaders here and across the globe gather to mourn his passing and honor his achievements, we examine the career and legacy of this remarkable Commander-in-Chief. Good morning, I'm Greg Grugan, and welcome to this special edition of What's Your Point, devoted to the life and service of the 41st President of the United States. As always, we have on board panelists who will call it like they see it, so let's meet them. Starting us off, Republican strategist Jessica Colon. Next up, Rice University political analyst Mark Jones. In the 3 spot, Jay Ayer, professor of political science at Texas Southern University. Batting cleanup, conservative commentator Jackie Baly. Next up, longtime Houston businessman and columnist Bill King. And closing us out, State Department veteran and professor of foreign policy Rick Sindelar of St. Thomas University. Let's begin. Naval aviator, oil patch entrepreneur, member of Congress, GOP chairman, ambassador to the United Nations, director of the CIA, vice president to Ronald Reagan. You could call the resume of George H.W. Bush a blueprint of preparation for leading the free world in the 20th century. Historians and political analysts, including some on this panel, have confidently pronounced this son of a powerful Connecticut senator uniquely qualified for the enormous challenges of the Oval Office. I'm going to start with Mark Jones. What about Bush when he came to the White House?
Well, as you mentioned, he was a World War II combat veteran. He served in the private sector, where he was a very successful businessman in the oil industry. Then went on to time in Congress, the legislative branch, Foreign Service, United Nations and China, directed the CIA, and was a vice president for 2 terms. You can't really come better prepared than that. Our current presidents and recent presidents haven't come close in terms of their resume.
Jay Ayer, you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was uniquely qualified. If you look at the totality of his career, sort of the combination of both just from a political perspective and also just from a governmental experience perspective, there's probably no one, certainly after him, and even in the immediate years before him, that approached his level of qualifications. I think it's fair to say no one was better prepared to be President of the United States than George H.W. Bush.
Rick Sindelar, as a veteran of the State Department, have you seen anyone who came to the job with this kind of qualification?
No, and first of all, I'd like to say it was really an honor to serve in his State Department, because I served during his full presidency in the State Department and working mainly Middle East issues at that time, Oslo Accords, Madrid Peace Conference. He was very active in that as well, Desert Storm. There was nobody else as qualified by far in foreign policy. I'll steal a thought from poor Bill before you've even gotten to him. If there was somebody, it was Jefferson, Secretary of State and Ambassador to France.
Jessica Colon, I remember your background. You led the Young Republicans at one point. As you came up, what was your impression of the competence of George H.W. Bush?
Well, I came of age during his presidency. I saw the Senator Marco Rubio said the same thing. You know, this was someone that we grew up with and someone that we had in our lives for 12 years, the formative years in childhood and as we came through high school and college, and his policies and his impact on our life at that time really shaped who we are today. Of course, with Desert Storm occurring, you know, in the early 90s, he's receiving many accolades now, as he well should, for going in, taking care of the problem, and getting out when he said he would. And that is something that that many people want him to be remembered for. But you know, as a party leader, he ravaged politics, and he loved everything behind the scenes. He was chairman of the Harris County Republican Party. We can't forget. He was congressman from CD7 here, and he was chairman of the Republican National Committee. And as his family was running for office, he and his wife were deeply involved in all the details of the machinations of their campaigns and didn't miss a beat.
Jackie, Baly, I'm going to share something with you. In 1980, I cast my first ballot as an adult, and I cast it for then presidential candidate George Herbert Walker Bush. He did not win, but he helped form Republicans in Texas and the rise of the Republican Party. Your thoughts?
Yes, we know Bush 41 to be a unifier. He wants to make sure that the party is together and wants to make sure that the party looks at all aspects. He really didn't look at things as party lines, even though, as Jessica mentioned, he was chairman of both the national and the local Republican Party. He was conservative in the way he looked at his finances, but he also wanted to make sure that we were an open tent and bring everyone together. And when we talk about his public service, let's look back at the very beginning when he was 18 years old. At the time, the youngest pilot in the Navy, and would float over 58 different missions. That really was perfect training for Desert Storm, the Gulf War, and everything else, and all of the wonderful things and more positive things that he did in foreign affairs.
Okay, Bill King, I've known you to be a connoisseur of competence. Is that what George Herbert Walker Bush brought to the White House?
Yeah, you know, Rick and I were talking before. I was trying to think if there was any president that came close to this, and the only one that I could come that was even vaguely close was Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, was, you know, a legislator. He was helped write the Declaration of Independence. He served as ambassador to France, Secretary of State, and Vice President. But even that didn't quite match up to Bush's resume. So no, I don't think there was ever anybody that was more prepared for this job in the history of the country.
Mark Jones, I wanted to ask you, what does that breadth of experience, what advantage does that give a chief executive?
Well, on the foreign policy side, it gave him a real wealth in terms of understanding how the CIA worked, how intelligence worked. He'd served in the United Nations in terms of broader diplomatic affairs, and he'd served as an envoy to China, so specific bilateral relations. And you go on the congressional side, he knew how Congress worked in a way that most, or at least many that arrived, do not. It allowed him to be a complete president, to be able to focus on foreign policy, domestic policy, and be as efficient and effective as possible. And that's, once again, something that we often lack these days.
J.R., can you extend on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing because he's really was sort of at this interesting pivotal point in terms of our country. Even one of the things that I thought was always interesting about him is that, you know, he saw the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the New World Order. He crafted together, and to Mark's point, brought that depth of experience, particularly on the foreign policy side. It's hard to imagine a scenario where another president without that level of experience would have been able to deal with the minefield of sort of the changing world and as abruptly as it changed during that period.
Okay, we're going to talk more about that. When we come back, in a world wrought with challenges, a skilled hand on the tiller, we discuss the 41st president's extraordinary prowess on the critical stage of foreign policy, so stay with us.
We're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
Welcome back. Few, if any, American presidents arrived at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue with the depth of foreign policy experience carefully accumulated by George H.W. Bush. Early on, he made the ouster of dictators who threatened freedom and democracy around the world a priority, removing Manuel Noriega from Panama and later Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. As the Berlin Wall crumbled, Bush deftly orchestrated a peaceful post-Cold War transition, avoiding violence and global chaos.
I think in terms of history, the coming down of the wall and the unification of Germany will be the most historic thing that happened on my watch.
As a critical prelude to the Gulf War, he assembled one of the most successful international military coalitions of the 20th century. 30 nations backed by a UN mandate, including the Soviet Union and several Arab countries, which expelled Saddam Hussein from Kuwait within 100 hours. Panel, is it accurate to label George Bush one of the most successful foreign policy leaders of the 20th century? Rick Sindelar, I start with you. It's your specialty.
Yes, obviously he was. The one thing that your lead-in misses is that he never did any of those things without slowly, in a measured fashion, with calmness and in a low-key fashion, advancing to the inevitable conclusion. Noriega, Saddam Hussein, they all could have been left in power had they agreed to what the program was at the time. And Noriega did not. He was taken down. Saddam Hussein was given months to pull out of Kuwait and did not. He could have challenged and gloated over the fact that we had won, in a quotation marks, the Cold War, and he did not. He's famous for, at that press conference, saying that he's not an excitable sort of guy. He wanted to give Gorbachev room to maneuver. It was always the calm, measured, persuasive way of doing business, which we really haven't seen since then, and very rarely before.
Mark Jones, as a fellow over at the Baker Institute, I suspect that you spent a little time talking about this nuanced approach to foreign policy.
Well, it was. I mean, we have to keep in mind that he took over at a very critical juncture in the world history. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that could have led to a really disastrous situation with Europe affected, instability in the Soviet Union. So it had to be handled very deftly in terms of allowing the transition to occur, but supporting it to keep chaos and instability from occurring. And he came out with really flying colors.
Okay, Jessica Colon, are you agreeing with what you're hearing?
Absolutely, and you hear President Clinton and President Obama extol President Bush for his wise foreign policy judgment during his administration that teed up the latter part of the 20th century as we headed into, where we are today. What is really underrated and you don't hear about is a lot of his work in foreign policy while he was vice president. And there are some incredible stories of bravery where he had to go in and make some really stern words to dictators and bad people all across the world to follow President Reagan's agenda. And I think that his loyalty to President Reagan during Reagan's administration is also something that helped him become a successful president and continue those policies. And a lot of what you hear about Reagan bringing an end to communism, Bush had to come in and clean that up and tie that up with a bow and make that work and continue that relationship with Gorbachev to make it not unstable as it proceeded forward, and not bragging about the success with the Berlin Wall and coming together with world leaders to continue that legacy for peace with Russia is a gargantuan legacy of the Bush administration.
Jay Ayer, are these accolades justified?
Yeah, I think they are justified. I think what made President Bush so unique was that he relied on diplomacy and restraint more than almost any other president had. I think Rick pointed out sort of he had a measured approach. He's the first to really establish what we now think is a norm, which is these broad multi-country coalitions that lead efforts. The accolades, I think, and that's one of the reasons why, as Jessica pointed out, you're seeing sort of bipartisan acknowledgement that what we now have in the world today is largely the result of the work that George H.W. Bush had done.
Jackie Baly, as you review the history, and as you remember, you lived it, what are your thoughts about the steady hand on the tiller, I called it?
Let's look at it. We have the signing of the START Treaty, which was the reduction of arms for both the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev has repeatedly said that that was in part because of the help that he received from President Bush. Let's look at Desert Storm, and it was ended in 100 hours. And instead of punting to Baghdad, he decided to form an alliance with other Arab states, which was unheard of at the time. A lot of the times we forget that our former president, President Bush, was also the CIA director. So he intimately knows all of the details when it comes to all of his foreign policies that he implemented while vice president and president.
Bill King, on a weekly basis, we're talking about crazy stuff going on the foreign policy front, driven in part by the current occupant. We wouldn't have had as much to talk about back then because things were much more, I guess, shall we say, low-key.
It's a contrast in styles, that's for sure. I want to underscore something that Jessica said, which I think is vastly overlooked. And that is that Reagan came into office with almost no foreign policy experience. And I think one of the reasons he chose Bush as his vice president was because he recognized that weakness, which was one of Reagan's great strengths, is to bring in people. He was a CEO in the true sense. I'm going to bring in experts and tell them what I want done. And from all accounts, Rick would probably know better than me, They seemed to have a great working relationship, and I think Reagan relied very heavily on Bush. And so he really had his hand on the tiller of foreign policy for not 4 years, but 12 years. And I think the impact he had over that 12-year period was enormous.
Rick, you've heard everybody's comments. What are we missing here? Is there something in the list of accomplishments that Houstonians, Texans, our viewers should know about?
Well, I think we've kind of touched upon it indirectly, but remember the era, one of his biggest accomplishments was the unification of Germany. He worked on that. He ended up with the 2+4 because the two Germanys were completely different. It was not expected that East Germany would suddenly there be any unification. Unification was kind of on the table. And he worked up a coalition of the old World War II 4 powers, Russia, France, Britain, and us. And with the other twos, that became your 2+4. Germany was unified, I think, within about the year.
Okay, Mark, and I want Jay to answer this too. Did the plethora of global activity and challenges hamstring George H.W. Bush on the domestic level? Did attract too much of his attention?
Well, on one hand, it did. All of his success in the foreign policy realm did lead people to believe that he was going to achieve re-election. And I don't know if he could have really dealt with it because the economy is often out of a president's hand, regardless of what people think. But the economy ended up being the thing that undermined him, along with a man named Ross Perot. That those two factors combined effectively allowed Bill Clinton to get ahead of him and win in the 1992 presidential election.
Jay, your thoughts?
Yeah, the irony of it is that what he's often, I think, criticized for was sort of coming back on the no new taxes pledge. That budget that he passed ironically set the stage for the, I think, an enhanced economic recovery that we saw in the latter part of the 90s. And so he took that personal short-term hit and sacrificing on a principle that he had said, recognizing the reality of what was needed in the economy. It led to him not getting reelected, but it ultimately led to the country, I think, doing well for the better part of the 90s.
We're going to talk about that more. Okay, up next, as always, Your Point Matters. We examine questions and comments from our viewers after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Like us, many of you are reflecting on the life, service, and impact of America's 41st president, both during his years at Washington and later here as a living icon in the Lone Star State. Longtime Watch Your Point supporter Warren Fawcett says President Bush may have been the last grown-up to serve as president. Well, you know, some George W.
I would think
might
his
take
dad
issue
might
to
take
that.
issue with that.
Jessica, you want to jump in here on that?
Yeah, you know, what I think Warren is alluding to is that he certainly is the last of a certain type of leader that we have seen. He's part of the greatest generation, and there is a certain style that comes with that. One of the biggest clashes, and I look forward to hearing the professor's views on this, is that a baby boomer defeated him in his reelection, and that there was a real generational battle between at that time in '92 with Bush's reelection, the values and principles of the greatest generation competing with the values and principles of the baby boomer generation. And so I think that what we saw with the diplomacy and the decency, you know, there's a story that President George W. Bush talks about that President Bush Sr., when he was a kid, came home and told his mom he hit a home run at the game, and his mom said, well, what did the team do? And there was this real innate nature of President Bush to think about the others, not talk about himself, and think outwardly, and that is, and to bring in the team, and that is something that we have seen a major change in American politics.
Cue Bill King's story about Mr. and Mrs. Bush here.
Yeah, so one of my very favorite memories of them was I was down at the Hobby Center one night to watch a play, and the lights were coming down and the play was about to start, and all of a sudden a door on one side of the theater opened, and because it was lighter outside, this kind of shaft of light shot in the room, and it kind of drew everybody's eye that direction, and in walked former President and First Lady, and quietly say hello to a couple people and sit down. There was an immediate, spontaneous standing ovation for him in that room. And I think what I think what people loved about them was the authenticity and the decency. And we are so lacking those today.
Amen. When we return, he served as a trusted advisor in the Bush White House and remained a lifelong friend of the 41st president. A special conversation with Ambassador Chase Untermeyer after the break. Welcome back. When it comes to the presidency of George H.W. Bush, it is fair to say Chase Untermeyer had a front row seat to history. He served as director of the Office of Presidential Personnel in the Bush White House, and a decade later was appointed ambassador to Qatar by his friend and mentor's son, George W. Bush, America's 43rd president. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, given your service, given your role as an ambassador, is it accurate to say that the 41st president was one of the most effective commander-in-chiefs when it came to global affairs in the 20th century?
Yes, and when you think of it, he had a lot of competition. If you start with Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson along the way, there were some giants there. And considering also that he was a one-term president, he packed quite a lot into those 4 years.
Look, what do you view as the elder, I call him the elder because I also covered George W., as his greatest achievement?
During the 4 years he was president, his greatest achievement was undoubtedly putting together the coalition of very different and in many ways hostile nations in the common cause of ousting Iraq from Kuwait. That was an amazing diplomatic achievement followed by an amazing military achievement. And people often forget, especially in the debate over whether he should have continued the war and gone on to Baghdad, that the existence of that coalition was something that he and James Baker wanted to use to create a larger settlement in the Middle East. And they made considerable progress in the months following the Gulf War in the so-called Madrid Agreement that led to the handshake on the South Lawn of the White House, ironically when Bill Clinton was president, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So that was an amazing achievement that's often overlooked in the larger story of the war.
That restraint, was that part of his nuanced approach?
He had it naturally. That was his way of doing things. The understated, never thrusting yourself to the fore, but making sure other people are acknowledged and involved was his style. And it found its best expression in leadership of a grand international coalition.
You have a long history with the president. You worked for him back in 1966 when he ran for Congress in the 7th Congressional District on the West Side. You have remained friends with him and Barbara for a lifetime. What were the qualities that attracted that kind of loyalty from you?
The same as with anybody. You know, many politicians talk about my friends, and they have friends, or it's better to say supporters. But the Bushes genuinely had hundreds and thousands of friends. And they did that by the simple expedient of paying attention to them and keeping in touch and being more interested in them than in what they themselves happened to have done or represented at the time.
You were with the president when he was vice president under President Reagan. 8 years. We talked about it with the panel earlier, but that was a political rivalry that transformed into a pretty powerful partnership for the good of the nation. Can you share any insights there?
Yes, we can forget too easily that it was a very bitter rivalry during the Republican primaries of 1979-1980. And in the Republican convention of 1980, when Ronald Reagan chose George Bush to be his running mate, it's pretty clear he did so with reluctance. He was unsure that Bush could truly support the Reagan agenda. He was uncomfortable having on the ticket a man who he thought of as, in many ways, a political enemy. And the fact that they two developed a great working relationship, but a true friendship, speaks to the capacity of both men for friendship. Maybe that shouldn't have been a surprise, but given the bitterness of their prior rivalry, it was a very happy surprise.
I'm told you're heading to Washington this week with the president. What are your hopes for what unfolds as the nation pays homage?
You know, great national events like this, state funerals, are not unlike it is in our ordinary lives. They're more for the living than the dead. You pay honor to the dead, but it's really what the living take from it. And clearly what can be taken from the life of George H.W. Bush is his commitment to service, to his belief in a greater United States in partnership with, not in rivalry with the rest of the world, and in constantly seeking to make it a better world through that kind of attitude. That's a very valuable thing at any point in our history, but especially now.
Ambassador, will you be accompanying the president?
Yes, my wife and I are being honored to go aboard Air Force One, or the plane often called Air Force One, with the casket and a small group of others, including former Secretary and Mrs. Baker, to Washington, and from there to the rotunda where the body will lie in state.
It will be a powerful few hours on that plane with the president.
Very, very much so.
Thank you, sir, Ambassador, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you for your service.
Sir.
Okay, still ahead, the 41st president as pioneer in the battle for civil rights, how Mr. Bush bettered the lives of millions challenged with disabilities. Stay with us. Welcome back. As the father of a 15-year-old son challenged with autism, I am particularly grateful to the 41st president, as are millions of my fellow citizens. In 1990, President Bush championed the landmark civil rights legislation known as the Americans with Disabilities Act, embedding into our law accommodations for education, transportation, housing, and telecommunications, regardless of a person's limitations. The legislation has been improving American lives ever since. President Bush is not frequently listed as a leader in civil rights, and I believe that is an oversight that historians should endeavor to correct. I'm going to start with Jackie Baly. You agree?
Oh, yes, definitely. A lot of us forget about the significant improvements that President Bush made sure happened for those with disabilities through the American Disabilities Act. When we're talking about his legacy, we often talk about foreign affairs and foreign policies, but we forget about that act and all of the improvements. And we also forget about the improvements he made to the Clean Air Act. There was a major sweep because of that, because of him. And it's very consistent throughout his career. When he was ambassador and convoy to China, that was a specific location he chose because he wanted to help the residents and citizens of Beijing. And even when he got out of office, tsunami victims, he's always wanted to help those who were underprivileged, who did not have those opportunities that a lot of us do have. So it's very consistent in the way he has carried himself, not only as president, but as a great man.
Bill King, you pay attention to the ADA. You think it's one of his greatest accomplishments?
Like, you know, you think about, if you go back, it's just been 20 years ago, you would never see a ramp at a curb, you know, and of course that's an incredible problem if you're in a wheelchair. And now they're everywhere, and it's just one of those things that this is part of his legacy that you walk over every day and you don't even think about. Now, I think one of the things that the Bushes brought to the Republican Party was a sense of compassion. Of course, his son ended up calling it compassionate conservatism. He had points of light. I mean, it was clear that they cared about people. And I think that's something missing from the Republican message right now, which is really hurting them.
Mark Jones, is this part of the Bush legacy? Does it get short shrift?
I think it does, because people, I think as Bill mentioned, it's become the normal. And it's like everybody's used to it. And that's actually the ideal in a situation. You know, legislation's been successful when it's just commonly accepted and it's part of everyday life. And so it really took a large segment of the population that was pushed out of essentially the mainstream and the ability to function, and brought them in and incorporated them in a way that's been fundamental and life-changing for millions and millions of Americans.
Okay, Jessica, you meano Republicans.
That's not true.
That's what I mean. You know,
right, exactly. So I think everyone has well articulated exactly the impact here. And as history moves on, and certainly as we go through this week, we're going to hear even more detail about that and the impact that that's had on people's lives. And you know, we are very blessed by the vision that he had. And I think what everyone is talking about and underscoring is the true sense of public service that the Bush family has had, and that is something that you you will hear more about President George H.W. Bush and the Bush family growing up with a true sense of public service and the public servants that they are, and that's just something that they are committed to. And that is what we certainly feel here in Houston, and why we feel on such a large community level such a loss, because we saw them out in the community supporting our community through all the different philanthropic works that they did.
We're going to talk about it in a second. Okay, still ahead, a one-term presidency, the factors which denied the 41st president a second 4 years in the White House. That's our discussion, part of it anyway, when we return.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That was the only time he would take the presidential oath of office. And it was this moment that many believe cost George Herbert Walker Bush the White House.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
After an extraordinary opening 24 months of his presidency and historic approval ratings to match, the Bush administration's popularity suffered a steep decline ahead of the 1992 election. Political opponents portrayed President Bush as aloof and detached on domestic issues, a criticism exacerbated by a nagging economic recession. That environment and resulting malaise opened the electoral door for charismatic Democrat Bill Clinton, who benefited immensely from the self-funded independent candidacy of Bush's fellow Texan H. Ross Perot. The rest, as they say, is history. I turn to Jay Ayer. Why was it a one-term presidency?
Well, I think simply put, it was the economy. We have a tendency, I think, to sometimes think of George H.W. Bush in terms of the foreign policy accomplishments, and they are significant. But it's a little bit like golf. When we say, you know, that saying, you drive for show, you putt for dough. Putting is what the economy really is about, at least in this case. That's what mattered. The economy was doing poorly. Clinton famously ran on, "It's the economy, stupid." President Bush was slow to react to it, slow to recognize it. The lingering deficits of the latter part of the 80s gave some sort of credence to the Perot campaign. It was very difficult for him to overcome that, and I think ultimately that's why he lost.
Mark Jones, you and I have had this discussion, you know, and I go back to victory parades, you know, and triumphs, and how quickly it changed. What happened?
Well, it really was a dramatic shift. If you recall, a year before nobody was thinking that he was going to lose. In fact, no serious Democrat wanted to get in the race. That's why there was opening for this guy from Arkansas, because all the other mainstream Democrats said, well, no, we're going to wait 2 more years because Bush is undefeatable. Then, of course, as Jay mentioned, the economy tanked at exactly the wrong time, with about 5 to 6 months to go before the election. Added to that, you had Ross Perot campaigning, who changed the dynamics of the race from a head-to-head race where Bush thought he could have done much better against Clinton to one where Bush was effectively fighting battles on both sides, both Clinton attacking him but also Perot attacking him. The end result was also not able to do something that was very difficult to do, and that's effectively trying to have 4 straight administrations from the same party. That's 16 years is a long haul for any party to do.
Okay, I'm going to blindside you, Rick. You know, as you and the State Department, other officials, you racked up all these wins. You're doing things the right way. All of a sudden, this guy gets knocked out. I mean, what was the reaction there?
Well, at the State Department, we were all shocked and surprised because, again, we live foreign policy, and he was doing so well with foreign policy. And I think most diplomats live what other Americans would consider a relatively privileged life with reasonable pay. So we weren't suffering the economy a lot of the rest of the country felt. So I'd also like to say, when we talk about domestic issues, that really I think both Ronald Reagan and President Bush 41 were the last 2 bipartisan presidents, so the last 2 to raise taxes. Remember that Neanderthal thing called a balanced budget? They were the last who really struggled for that. They completely changed the communist world into a new world order. We were very surprised, yes.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears here to something that's very important to this discussion. President Bush spent all but a very small portion of his life squarely in the public eye, pushing the people of our nation to be better than they were the day before. It was a personal, philosophy capsulized in the belief that everyone should be a point of light.
I've spoken of 1,000 points of light, of all the community organizations that are spread like stars throughout the nation doing good.
Known as the first Houstonian who rapidly transformed into a people's president, always up for an Astros game, a Super Bowl coin flip, or in time of crisis, partnership with the other past presidents to rally support and resources for Americans in need. Jackie Baly, has any president moved past the presidency in better fashion than this one?
Well, if you listen to President Bush 41, he will say that his son did. He said one of the best things that he's seen is that his sons, both Jeb and former President 43 Bush, was that they are able to show compassion and empathy in a very good way. He said that was a gift that he and Barbara gave to them, and he's very proud of his sons and the way that they have reached out to many different communities who needed their aid and assistance. We often hear about compassion when we talk about Bush 41. I think his exit from the White House is a perfect example. His handwritten letter that he wrote to President Clinton when he was leaving the office, he was very disappointed, of course, that he lost, but he said, you are the president now, and I support you 100%. I am behind you. Let me know how I can assist you, how I can help you. Making sure that his successor, the person who beat him, was going to have a very peaceful and good and easy transition is something that you don't see often these days. But that's something that President Bush made sure that happened to President Clinton, and as a result, they became lifelong friends. That really shows you the kind of man that he is.
Bill King is the unapologetic advocate for bipartisanship and someone who's lived here his whole life and watched the Bushes in retirement. Your thoughts?
Listen, Bush could certainly was a partisan and could throw some sharp elbows in an election, but at the end of the day, it was always country over party. And I think the way that he acted as an advisor to Clinton afterwards, I mean, Clinton called on him. They obviously became very close, and he offered Clinton the benefit of his experience because he was more concerned about the country succeeding than he was about Clinton failing. And that's the dynamic we're into today. All we care about is our side succeeding and the other side failing, and somewhere in that, the interests of the country are getting lost.
Save some time for these guys, but I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, you know, I think the last line of that letter that Jackie was talking about, it says, "I'm rooting hard for you." And what an amazing thing for to come in and receive that from the person you just defeated, to show that that's the type of step that they want to take forward with you. It's really remarkable that we had 25 years with President Bush post-presidency. And I think the reason that so many people feel so connected to the Bush family and to President George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush themselves is because the character that they exhibited over the course of these 2.5 decades, people feel like they got to know the people, not the politician, not the first lady, not the president, but George and Barbara. And I think that just that incredible human element is what has connected hundreds of thousands and millions of people across the world with this amazing couple.
Mark Jones, has it been a highly successful post-presidency?
I think, yeah, very much so, in the sense of both the achievements that he made in terms of helping his fellow presidents, aid operations like helping in Haiti, Harvey relief, that definitely, but also I think the image he set of being a president of the people, that he was out there with regular Houstonians at different games, at baseball games, at concerts, at regular restaurants, not just elite restaurants in a back room. He lived a life as much as a former president who's wealthy can as a regular American. I think people really respected him. And as I think he's really the last truly American president that he was a Republican, but he represented all Americans, as has been mentioned. And that's why I think we always have seen these standing ovations, in the sense that it's not seen as a partisan ovation. It's not Republicans clapping and Democrats sitting silent, or vice versa. It was clapping for who he was, not as a Republican president, but as the former president of the United States. We're
going to leave it right there. Okay, when we come back, final thoughts from our panel on the legacy of America's 41st president. Stay with us. Welcome back. in the week to come, you will hear much about the expansive legacy of George Herbert Walker Bush. To that end, we posed the question to our panel, what resonates most significantly in this American life? Jessica Colon.
One thing we haven't talked about on the panel today is him as the patriarch of the family, and the Bush family and their love for each other and their loyalty to each other is something that is a legacy in and of itself, and something that people are inspired by and really look to. And when you hear his grandchildren talk about their Gampy, you really get to understand that relationship and that love and that respect and that beautiful, beautiful dynamic within the Bush family.
Mark Jones.
Well, I think carrying off what Jessica said, while President Bush is no longer with us, we do have a part of the Bush family legacy still here in Texas. That is George P. Bush, the Texas Land Commissioner, is the one member of the Bush family that's still very active in politics, and I think has a bright future ahead of him, representing a lot of the ideals and values that were instilled in him by his father and by his grandparents.
Jay Ayer.
What we often overlook is that he was really the first environmental president of the modern era, right? We talk about the Kyoto Accords, the acknowledgement of climate change as a real issue. In fact, the climate report that just came out this week is a direct result of something he started when he was in office.
Jackie Baly.
President Bush was a young man who graduated from Yale in 2.5 years as Phi Beta Kappa while being captain of his baseball team. So of course he was driven. But when he and Barbara talk about legacies, they're really talking about a legacy of public service. And they want to make sure that their children and 17 grandchildren continue that legacy of public service. And we've seen it by their outreach in Houston and in Texas and in the country.
10 seconds each. Go, Bill.
He and Barbara were married for 73 years. He was the first girl he ever kissed.
Wow. Rick Sindelar.
We're talking legacy. We shouldn't talk legacy. We should say his legacy is a return to his style of diplomacy.
I like that. That's all the time we have. Thanks to our team. And remember, keep it right here. Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace is coming up at the top of the hour. And please join Fox 26 throughout the week as Houston and the nation pay tribute to America's 41st president. So long.